Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because the crisp night air nipped at my exposed skin as I unrolled my sleeping bag beneath the canopy of towering pines. The ancient trees creaked and groaned, their branches swaying in the gentle breeze, filling me with a deep-seated unease. A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't help but glance around the dimly lit campsite, my eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. A sudden snap of a twig in the distance caused me to freeze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, listening intently for any other sounds that might betray the presence of an unseen predator. The forest was alive with the chirping of crickets and the hooting of owls, but beneath those familiar noises I could sense an underlying tension, as if the very wilderness itself was holding its breath. Laughter and the crackle of the campfire drew my attention back to the center of our makeshift campsite. My friends were huddled around the dancing flames, their faces illuminated by the warm glow as they shared stories and joked with one another. The sounds of their merriment helped to dispel the growing unease that had been slowly building within me, and I let out a slow, steadying breath. "Hey Jake, come join us," called out my best friend Matt, beckoning me to the campfire. I forced a smile and made my way over, settling down onto a fallen log next to him. The familiar faces and the comforting presence of my friends quickly put me at ease, and I found myself starting to relax, the worries and fears of the dark forest fading into the background. As the night wore on, the crackling flames slowly dimmed, and one by one my companions began to retire to their tents. I followed suit, crawling into my sleeping bag and snuggling down into the soft, warm fabric. My eyelids felt heavy, and the soothing sounds of the forest lulled me into a sense of tranquility. Just before drifting off to sleep, I glanced up at the stars twinkling overhead, marveling at their beauty. The sudden, blood-curdling scream that shattered the peaceful silence of the night jolted me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat up with a start, my eyes wide and my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the horrific sound. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Matt's head poked out of his tent, his expression a mirror of my own. "I don't know, man," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It sounded like it came from the woods." We both froze, straining our ears for any other sounds that might give us a clue as to what had happened. The forest had gone eerily quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a lone owl. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the flap of my tent and peered out into the darkness. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. I scanned the area, searching for any sign of our missing friend, but the shadows seemed to have swallowed him up. "Tom?" I called out, my voice quivering. "Tom, are you there?" No response. Matt emerged from his tent, his face ashen. "We have to go look for him," he said, his voice barely audible. I nodded in agreement, my mind racing as I tried to prepare myself for what we might find. Grabbing a flashlight, I led the way into the dark, foreboding forest, my senses on high alert for any sign of danger. As we pushed through the undergrowth, the oppressive silence of the woods weighed heavily upon us, the only sound the crunching of leaves and twigs beneath our feet. The beam of my flashlight danced across the trees, casting flickering shadows that seemed to taunt us with their eerie movements. "Tom!" I called out again, my voice echoing through the trees. "Where are you?" Still, there was no response, only the eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. We pressed on, our pace quickening as fear and worry fueled our steps. The further we ventured into the forest, the more the shadows seemed to close in around us, the oppressive darkness becoming almost suffocating. Just when I was about to suggest turning back, a movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared into the inky blackness, searching for the source of the disturbance. And then, I saw it, a massive, hulking figure, its silhouette looming against the backdrop of the trees. My heart raced as I stared in disbelief, my mind struggling to comprehend what my eyes were telling me. "Matt," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" My friend's eyes widened in horror as he spotted the towering figure, and we both stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear that seemed to seep into our very bones. The creature let out a bone-chilling roar, its guttural cry echoing through the forest, and in that moment, I knew that we had stumbled upon something truly terrifying. A creature that defied all explanation, a monster that seemed to have stepped straight out of the stuff of nightmares. My heart pounding in my chest, I frantically scrambled out of my tent, the zipper catching on the fabric as I fought to free myself. The agonizing scream that had shattered the peaceful night still echoed in my ears, and I frantically scanned the campsite, searching for any sign of what had happened. "Tom!" I called out, my voice trembling with fear. "Where are you?" There was no response, only the eerie silence of the forest that seemed to press in around me. I turned to Matt, who had emerged from his own tent, his face pale and drawn. "Did you see anything?" I asked, desperately hoping he might have some information that could shed light on the situation. He shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "No, I didn't see anything, but I heard that scream, and it sounded like it came from the woods." A sudden movement in the shadows beyond the campfire caught my eye, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A massive, hulking figure emerged, towering over the treetops, its silhouette obscuring the stars that had once shone so brightly in the night sky. "Oh God," I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is that?" The creature let out a bone-chilling roar, its guttural cry echoing through the trees, and I felt a shiver of pure terror run down my spine. Matt let out a strangled cry and stumbled back, his eyes wide with panic. "Run!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But I couldn't move, my feet rooted to the spot as the creature lumbered towards us, its massive clawed hands reaching out with blinding speed. Before I could react, it pounced, its powerful grip closing around my arm with a crushing force. Searing pain shot through my limb, and I let out a scream of agony, my knees buckling beneath me. The creature lifted me off the ground with ease, its grip tightening as I struggled futilely against its strength. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Matt trying to flee, but the creature swung its massive arm, backhanding him with a force that sent him flying through the air. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, his body crumpling lifelessly. The creature's vice-like grip on my arm was unbearable, and I felt the bones in my limb grinding together as it squeezed. I cried out in agony, tears streaming down my face as I begged for the pain to stop. "Please," I gasped, my voice barely audible. "Let me go." But the creature seemed to ignore my pleas, its glowing eyes fixed on me with an unwavering intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel the heat of its foul breath on my face, its guttural growls rumbling in my ears, and I knew in that moment that I was facing a true, unadulterated evil. Suddenly, the creature's grip loosened, and I felt myself being hurled through the air. I hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact, my injured arm flaring with fresh pain. Dazed and disoriented, I turned my head to see what had happened, and the sight that met my eyes filled me with a sickening horror. My friend Samantha lay motionless on the ground, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The creature had tossed her aside with effortless ease, her lifeless body crumpling to the forest floor like a discarded rag doll. I stared in stunned silence, my mind reeling as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Samantha, the vibrant, laughing girl I had known just moments ago, was gone, her life snuffed out by the savage brutality of the creature that now loomed over me. I knew then that I had to get away, to escape the nightmare that had descended upon our peaceful camping trip. Adrenaline surging through my veins, I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my shattered arm, and I ran for my life, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the monstrous creature as possible. As I fled, the creature's haunting roar echoed behind me, a grim reminder of the horror I had just witnessed. I knew that I would never be able to unsee the images that were now seared into my mind, the lifeless body of my friend, the crushing grip of the creature's claws. And as I ran, a sickening realization dawned on me. No one would ever believe what had happened here tonight. They would think I was crazy, a delusional fool who had concocted some fantastical tale of a mythical beast. But I knew the truth, and that knowledge would haunt me for the rest of my days. The forest was a blur of shadows and menace as I ran, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. Branches whipped across my face, leaving stinging scratches, but I couldn't slow down. The creature's roars still echoed behind me, spurring me on despite the agony in my crushed arm. Keep going, I gasped to myself, pushing through the undergrowth. My mind raced, replaying the horrific scenes I'd just witnessed. Samantha's broken body, Matt's limp form flying through the air. The images were seared into my brain. But I couldn't afford to dwell on them now. I had to survive. The ground beneath my feet was treacherous, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. I stumbled more than once, my injured arm sending waves of nausea through me each time I jarred it. But the fear of what lurked behind me was a powerful motivator. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" I shouted as I ran, hoping against hope that there might be other campers, rangers, anyone who could help. But my cries were swallowed by the darkness, unanswered. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming an impenetrable wall of darkness. I had no idea where I was going, no sense of direction in this green maze. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. A distant crash made me flinch, my heart leaping into my throat. Was it following me? The thought sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system, and I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my legs and the stabbing pain in my side. "Please, please, please," I muttered, a desperate prayer to any deity that might be listening. "Let me get out of here." The sound of rushing water reached my ears, growing louder as I ran. A river? It might offer a way out, or at least a chance to throw off any pursuit. I angled towards the noise, hope giving me a second wind. But fate had other plans. In my haste, I failed to notice the sudden drop-off ahead. One moment I was running, the next, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I had just enough time for a startled yelp before I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. The world spun around me as I rolled, unable to control my descent. Rocks and branches battered my body, each impact sending fresh waves of pain through me. I cried out as my injured arm struck something solid, the agony nearly causing me to black out. Finally, mercifully, I came to a stop at the bottom of the slope. I lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented, every inch of my body screaming in protest. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, and I could feel warm wetness trickling down my face. "Get up," I wheezed, forcing myself to move. "You can't stay here." Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. My left leg buckled immediately, sending a sharp pain shooting up from my ankle. Sprained, maybe broken, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The sound of water was closer now, and I could make out the silvery gleam of a river through the trees. It was my best chance at finding my way out of this nightmare. Limping heavily, I made my way towards the water. Each step was an exercise in agony, but the fear of what might be following me kept me moving. The trees began to thin out, and soon I found myself on the rocky bank of a fast-flowing river. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Rivers led to civilization, right? If I could follow it downstream, I might find help. But as I stared at the churning water, another realization hit me. I was in no condition to navigate those rapids. A sound from the forest behind me made me whirl around, nearly losing my balance. Was that a growl? Or just the wind in the trees? I couldn't be sure, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. With no other options, I began to make my way along the riverbank. The going was slow and treacherous, the rocks slick with spray from the river. More than once I nearly lost my footing, saved only by grabbing onto nearby vegetation with my good arm. "Just keep moving," I muttered to myself, a constant mantra to keep the pain and fear at bay. One step at a time. I don't know how long I stumbled along that riverbank. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness, marked only by the throbbing of my injuries and the constant rush of the water beside me. My mind began to wander, exhaustion and shock taking their toll. I thought of my friends, left behind in that clearing. Were they really gone? Or had I imagined the whole thing? Maybe this was all some vivid, terrible nightmare, and I'd wake up soon in my tent, laughing about it with the others over breakfast. But the pain was too real, the fear too visceral. This was happening, no matter how much I wished it wasn't. A clearing ahead caught my attention, and I quickened my pace as much as my battered body would allow. As I drew closer, I realized it wasn't a natural clearing at all, but a small man-made structure, a ranger station, or maybe a storage shed for kayakers. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and weak. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." No response came from the dark building, but it was shelter, and that was something. I limped towards it, hope and desperation warring within me. The door was locked, of course. In my current state, there was no way I could force it open. But there was a small window on the side, just big enough for me to squeeze through if I could break it. I looked around for something to use, finally settling on a fist-sized rock. With my good arm, I swung it at the window, flinching at the loud crack of breaking glass. It took a few more hits to clear away enough of the sharp edges for me to attempt entry. Painfully, awkwardly, I managed to haul myself through the window, collapsing onto the floor inside with a groan. The interior was dark and musty, but it was enclosed, protected. For the first time since the attack, I allowed myself to feel a modicum of safety. My body screamed for rest, but I forced myself to move, to check the building for anything useful. A first aid kit, a radio, anything that might help me survive and get rescued. A small desk in the corner yielded a battery-powered lantern, which I switched on with shaking hands. The weak light revealed a Spartan interior, some shelves with equipment I couldn't identify, a couple of chairs, and a small cot in the corner. But no radio, no phone, no way to call for help. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I sank to the floor, my back against the wall. I was alone, injured, with no way to contact the outside world. And somewhere out there, that creature was still roaming free. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. My arm was a mess, swollen and discolored, and I suspected at least one broken bone. My ankle throbbed relentlessly, and various cuts and bruises added their voices to the chorus of pain. Using the lantern, I managed to locate a dusty first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it was something. I cleaned and bandaged what wounds I could, using up most of the supplies in the process. There was nothing I could do for my arm or ankle except try to immobilize them as best I could. Exhaustion was pulling at me now, the events of the night catching up in a wave of bone-deep weariness. I knew I should try to stay awake, to keep watch, but my body had other ideas. I dragged myself onto the cot, every movement and exercise in agony. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. My friends were gone. I was alone, injured, miles from help, and there was a monster out there, a creature that shouldn't exist, that had attacked us without provocation or mercy. Tears began to flow, silent sobs racking my battered body. How had a simple camping trip turned into this nightmare? And how could I ever make anyone believe what had happened? As consciousness began to slip away, one thought echoed in my mind. I had to survive. I had to make it out of here, to tell someone what had happened. For my friends, for myself, I had to find a way. With that grim determination, I finally surrendered to exhaustion, slipping into a fitful, nightmare-plagued sleep. My legs felt like lead, each step a monumental effort as I stumbled through the dense undergrowth. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and more menacing with each passing moment. My lungs burned, and my injured arm throbbed relentlessly, a constant reminder of the horror I had narrowly escaped. As I pushed through a tangle of branches, I suddenly found myself in a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting an eerie glow over the leaf-strewn ground. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. Just need to rest, I wheezed, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, fear kept me alert. I couldn't stop here, not out in the open where that thing could easily spot me. With the last of my strength, I crawled towards a thick bush at the edge of the clearing, hoping it would provide some cover. As I huddled behind the bush, I tried to quiet my ragged breathing, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. The forest was unnaturally silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I peered out from my hiding spot, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement. The memory of those glowing eyes and massive hulking form sent a shiver down my spine. How could something so large move so silently through the forest? It's not real, I muttered to myself, trying to cling to some semblance of rationality. It can't be real. Things like that don't exist. But the pain in my arm and the vivid image of my friends' broken bodies told a different story. This was happening, no matter how impossible it seemed. As the minutes ticked by, I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had lost the creature. Perhaps it had given up the chase, or gotten distracted by easier prey. The thought of it hunting other innocent campers made my stomach churn, but self-preservation overrode my guilt. I was just starting to consider moving on when a thunderous snap echoed through the clearing. My heart leapt into my throat, and I instinctively pressed myself closer to the ground, trying to make myself as small as possible. The sound had come from the far side of the clearing where the shadows were deepest. I stared into the darkness, my eyes wide with terror, willing them to adjust and reveal what was hiding there. Slowly, agonizingly, a massive form began to take shape. It moved with an unnatural grace for something so large, each step deliberate and silent save for the occasional crack of a branch beneath its weight. As it entered the moonlit clearing, I had to bite back a scream. The creature was even more terrifying up close, its matted fur glistening wetly in the pale light. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce right through my flimsy hiding place and into my very soul. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the beast must hear it. Please, I thought desperately, please just pass by. Don't see me, don't smell me, just go away. But my silent prayers went unanswered. The creature's head swiveled in my direction, its nostrils flaring as it caught my scent. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its chest, a sound so primal and filled with malice that it sent ice through my veins. With agonizing slowness, it began to move towards my hiding spot. Each step brought it closer, its massive form blotting out the moonlight. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there paralyzed with fear. But my body refused to respond, frozen in place as the monster approached. As it reached the bush, I could smell its foul breath, a mixture of rotting meat and something far worse. Its face loomed over me, jaws gaping wide to reveal rows of yellowed, razor-sharp teeth. In that moment, staring death in the face, a strange calm washed over me. I thought of my friends, of my family, of all the things I'd never get to do or say. If this was the end, I wanted to face it with whatever courage I could muster. "Do it," I whispered, my voice trembling but defiant. "Just get it over with." The creature paused as if confused by my words. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if there was some spark of intelligence behind those terrifying eyes, some capacity for mercy or understanding. But then it lunged, and all such thoughts vanished in a rush of terror and adrenaline. I threw myself to the side, feeling the rush of air as its massive claws barely missed me. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet and ran, ignoring the screaming pain in my arm and the burning in my lungs. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear the creature's enraged roar and the sound of it giving chase. It was faster than me, stronger than me, and knew these woods far better than I ever could. But I ran anyway, driven by a primal need to survive that overrode all else. I didn't know where I was going or how long I could keep this up. All I knew was that to stop meant death, and I wasn't ready to die. Not here, not like this. As I fled deeper into the forest, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer, one thought burned in my mind. I had to find a way out of this nightmare, no matter the cost. Because if I didn't, if that thing caught me, then no one would ever know what happened here. My friends' deaths would go unexplained, and this monster would continue to roam free, hunting and killing with impunity. With that grim determination fueling me, I pushed on into the darkness, the creature's hot breath practically on my neck. The ordeal was far from over, and I knew that the coming hours would test me in ways I couldn't even imagine. But I had to survive. I had to. I stood there, frozen in terror, my eyes squeezed shut as I braced for the inevitable. The creature's hot, putrid breath washed over me, and I could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was it. This was how I was going to die. But the attack never came. Seconds stretched into an eternity as I waited for the crushing blow, the tearing of flesh, the end of everything. Yet somehow, I remained standing, trembling but untouched. Confusion began to mingle with the fear coursing through my veins. Slowly, cautiously, I cracked open one eye, then the other. The sight before me was so unexpected, so utterly bewildering, that for a moment I thought I must be hallucinating. The creature, that monstrous, terrifying beast that had pursued me relentlessly through the forest, was turning away. Its massive form lumbered slowly into the shadows, each heavy footfall sending tremors through the ground beneath my feet. I watched in stunned disbelief as it disappeared into the darkness, swallowed up by the dense foliage as if it had never existed at all. What? What just happened? I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse and barely audible. For several long moments I remained rooted to the spot, afraid that any movement might bring the creature charging back. But as the seconds ticked by and the forest remained silent save for the usual nocturnal sounds, I began to realize that it was truly gone. Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave, and I sagged against a nearby tree, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. The adrenaline that had been keeping me going began to ebb away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and an awareness of just how badly I was hurt. My arm, crushed in the creature's vice-like grip, throbbed with an intensity that made me nauseous. Various cuts and bruises from my frantic flight through the forest made themselves known, each one a stinging reminder of the ordeal I'd just survived. Got to move, I muttered, gritting my teeth against the pain. With a monumental effort, I pushed myself away from the tree and took a tentative step. My legs shook beneath me, threatening to give way, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to get back to the campsite, had to find help, had to do something. Every step was agony, my battered body protesting each movement. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just hours ago now felt oppressive and alien, full of shadows that might hide unspeakable horrors. More than once I stumbled and fell, each time wondering if I'd have the strength to get back up. But somehow, I kept going. The thought of my friends, of what had happened to them, drove me forward even as it filled me with dread. I had to know, had to see for myself, even though part of me wanted nothing more than to run as far and fast as I could in the opposite direction. As I neared the campsite, a sickening smell reached my nostrils, the metallic scent of blood mixed with something far worse. My stomach churned, and I had to stop for a moment, leaning against a tree as I fought the urge to vomit. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was pleading with. "Please let this all be a nightmare." But as I stumbled into the clearing where we had set up camp, The horrific reality hit me full force. Our tents lay in tatters, supplies scattered everywhere as if a tornado had torn through the site. And there, illuminated by the weak light of dawn, were the bodies of my friends. "Oh God, no!" I choked out, stumbling towards them. "No, no, no." They lay where they had fallen, broken and lifeless. Tom, his chest crushed by the creature's powerful blow. Samantha, her neck at an unnatural angle from being tossed aside like a rag doll. And Matt, his body crumpled at the base of a tree where he had been thrown in the creature's initial attack. The sight of them, of the friends I had laughed with just hours ago, now reduced to lifeless shells, was too much. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to my knees, cradling my injured arm against my chest. "I'm sorry," I sobbed, the words tearing themselves from my throat. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't save you." The weight of what had happened, of what I had witnessed and survived, came crashing down on me. The trauma of the night's events threatened to overwhelm me entirely. And for a moment, I considered just lying down next to my friends and waiting for the end to come. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I knew I couldn't do it. I owed it to them, to their families, to survive and tell their story, even if no one believed me. And how could they, when I could scarcely believe it myself? I had to try. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, praying that it had survived the night's chaos. By some miracle, it was still in my pocket, the screen cracked but functional. My fingers shook so badly I could barely dial, but finally, I managed to punch in 911. As the phone rang, I looked around the devastated campsite one last time. In the growing light of day, it all seemed so surreal, like a scene from a horror movie rather than something that had actually happened. But the pain in my body and the sight of my friends' bodies were all too real. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice cut through my shock. Help, I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. Please. There's been an attack. My friends, they're dead. We need help. Sir, can you tell me your location? I gave her the name of the campground and as much detail as I could about where we had set up camp. As I spoke, I realized how insane my story would sound. How could I possibly explain what had happened here? Sir, can you tell me what kind of attack this was? The operator asked, her voice still professionally calm but with an undercurrent of concern. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it again. How could I describe the creature? Who would believe me? I don't know, I finally said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. It all happened so fast. Please just send help. My arm. I think it's broken, and my friends. Help is on the way, sir. Please stay on the line with me until they arrive. As I waited, listening to the operator's reassurances and trying to answer her questions as best I could, I stared at the forest around us. Somewhere out there, that creature was still roaming free, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that no one would ever believe the truth of what had happened here. The sound of distant sirens reached my ears, and a mix of relief and dread washed over me. Help was coming, but with it would come questions I didn't know how to answer. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, I steeled myself for what was to come. The night of terror might be over, but I knew that in many ways, my ordeal was just beginning. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon as I stumbled into the small town of Pine Creek. My clothes were torn and bloodied, my arm hung uselessly at my side, and my eyes darted wildly, searching for any sign of help. The quiet streets were just beginning to stir with early risers, but my appearance and frantic cries seemed to repel rather than attract attention. Please, I shouted, my voice hoarse and desperate. Someone help me. There's been an attack in the forest. A woman walking her dog quickened her pace, averting her eyes. An elderly man paused in sweeping his porch, only to hurry inside and shut the door. My pleas echoed off the buildings, met only with the sound of locks clicking and curtains being drawn. Frustration and despair threatened to overwhelm me. Didn't they understand? Couldn't they see I needed help? Finally, I spotted the sheriff's office, a small weathered building with a squad car parked out front. Summoning the last of my strength, I staggered toward it, practically falling through the door. The sheriff, a burly man with a salt and pepper mustache, looked up from his desk with a mixture of surprise and wariness. "What in tarnation?" "Sheriff," I gasped, collapsing into a chair. "There's been an attack. In the forest. My friends, they're dead. You have to help me." He leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Slow down, son. What kind of attack are we talking about here? Bear? Mountain lion?" I shook my head vehemently. No, you don't understand. It was huge. Bigger than anything I've ever seen. It walked on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. It was Bigfoot," the sheriff finished, his tone suddenly cold and skeptical. "Yes," I exclaimed, relief washing over me. "Yes, that's exactly what it was. You have to believe me, Sheriff. It killed my friends, it nearly killed me. We have to go back. We have to find it before it hurts anyone else." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Now listen here, son. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, or what you've been smoking up in those woods, but there's no such thing as Bigfoot. Not here, not anywhere. But Sheriff, I saw it with my own eyes. It was real, I swear to you." He shook his head, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Look, kid, we get a few of you every year, claiming you've seen Bigfoot or aliens or whatnot. It's always the same story, and it always turns out to be nothing but a bear and an overactive imagination. Now, do you need medical attention? Because otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I stared at him in disbelief. How could he dismiss me so easily? Didn't he see my injuries, the terror in my eyes? "Fine," I spat, pushing myself to my feet. "If you won't help me, I'll find the proof myself." Ignoring the sheriff's protests, I stormed out of the office. My mind raced as I made my way back toward the forest. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. If no one would believe me, I'd have to find evidence that would make them believe. The forest loomed before me, dark and foreboding even in the morning light. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig sent a jolt of fear through me. But I pressed on, retracing my steps as best I could remember. As I neared the campsite, a sense of dread washed over me. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very trees were holding their breath. The lingering presence of the creature seemed to permeate every shadow, every clearing. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "It's gone. You saw it leave." But even as I said the words, I didn't fully believe them. How could I be sure it wasn't still out there, watching, waiting? Finally, I stumbled into the clearing where we had made camp. My heart sank as I took in the scene, where I had expected to find signs of the brutal attack. Torn tents, scattered supplies, maybe even remains. I found only the charred remnants of our campfire. "No," I whispered, dropping to my knees. "No, this can't be right." I scrambled around the clearing, searching desperately for any sign of what had happened. A scrap of torn clothing, a splash of blood, anything that would prove I hadn't imagined it all. But there was nothing. As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. How could this be? I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The pain in my arm, the terror that still gripped my heart. Those were real. But where was the evidence? I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind reeling. Had I somehow dreamed it all? Was I going insane? Or had the creature been so careful, so meticulous in covering its tracks, that it left no trace behind? The sound of voices in the distance snapped me out of my daze. Park rangers, probably alerted by the sheriff despite his disbelief. Panic seized me. What would they think when they found me here, alone, raving about a monster that left no trace? Would they believe me? Or would they dismiss me as a madman, maybe even accuse me of harming my friends myself? I couldn't face that. Not now. Not when I was still trying to make sense of it all myself. With one last, desperate look around the clearing, I turned and fled deeper into the forest. The horror of that night was seared into my memory, a nightmare I knew I would never forget. But as I ran, I realized that the real nightmare was only just beginning. How could I ever make anyone believe what had happened here? How could I honor my friend's memory when I couldn't even prove they had died? And most terrifying of all, if I couldn't prove the creature's existence, how could I warn others of the danger that still lurked in these woods? These questions chased me as I ran, each step taking me further from the site of the attack but no closer to answers or peace. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed incessantly, their harsh glare only accentuating the dark circles under my eyes. I sat across from Sheriff Dawson, my hands trembling as I recounted my horrific experience for what felt like the 100th time. "Please, Sheriff," I begged, my voice hoarse from hours of pleading. "You have to believe me. There's something out there in those woods, something dangerous. We need to warn people to keep them safe." Sheriff Dawson leaned back in his chair, his weathered face a mask of skepticism. "Son, we've been over this. We sent search parties out to the campsite. They found nothing, no bodies, no blood, no signs of any kind of struggle or attack." "But that's impossible," I exclaimed, frustration bubbling up inside me. "I saw it with my own eyes. It killed my friends, it nearly killed me. How can there be no evidence?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Now listen here. I've been polite up until now, but I'm starting to lose my patience. We've got 3 missing persons, that's true enough. But there's not a lick of evidence to support your wild story about some Bigfoot creature." "It wasn't just some story," I shouted, slamming my good hand on the desk. "It was real. Why won't you believe me?" "Because, young man," Dawson said, his voice dripping with condescension, "what you're describing is pure imagination. Stress, fear, and darkness can play tricks on the mind. Whatever happened out there, I can assure you it wasn't some mythical monster." I slumped back in my chair, defeat washing over me. How could I make them understand when they refused to even consider the possibility? "What about my injuries?" I asked weakly, gesturing to my arm, still in a sling. "How do you explain those?" The sheriff sighed. "You said yourself you fell down an embankment while running through the woods at night. That accounts for your injuries. As for your friends, well, we'll keep searching. But I'm warning you, son. If we find out you had anything to do with their disappearance—" "I didn't," I protested, horrified at the implication. "They were my friends. I would never—" "That's enough," Dawson cut me off. "Go home, get some rest, and please, for your own sake, stop spreading these stories. You're only making things harder for yourself and for the families of your missing friends." Defeated, I left the station, the weight of disbelief crushing down on me. As I stepped out into the street, I saw a group of people approaching, the families of Tom, Samantha, and Matt. Their faces were etched with grief and worry, and for a moment I thought maybe they would understand, that they would believe me. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," I called out, approaching Tom's parents. "I'm so sorry about Tom. I tried to save him, I really did, but the creature—" "Don't," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice breaking. "Please, just don't. We don't want to hear any more of your stories." "But it's not a story," I insisted. "I'm trying to tell you what really happened." Mr. Thompson stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "Enough. Our son is missing, possibly dead, and you have the audacity to stand here and spin tales about monsters? What's wrong with you?" I turned to the others, desperate for someone, anyone, to believe me. But I saw only anger, grief, and disbelief in their eyes. One by one, they turned away, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk. The days that followed were a blur of isolation and despair. I retreated to my apartment, unable to face the accusing stares and whispered comments that followed me everywhere in town. My phone rang incessantly, reporters hungry for a sensational story, skeptics wanting to debunk my claims, and occasionally the police with more questions. I ignored them all. Depression settled over me like a heavy blanket, smothering any hope or joy. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's terrifying form, heard its bone-chilling roar. The memories of that night played on an endless loop in my mind, as vivid and terrifying as if it were happening all over again. It was real, I muttered to myself, over and over, a mantra to keep me sane. It was real, it was real, it was real. But with each passing day, with each dismissal and look of disbelief, a small seed of doubt began to grow. Had I imagined it all? Was my mind playing tricks on me? The lack of evidence, the impossibility of what I'd seen, it all began to wear on me. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror staring at my haggard reflection. The man looking back at me was a stranger, pale, gaunt, with wild eyes and unkempt hair. "You know what you saw?" I told my reflection. "You know it was real." But even as I said the words, the creature's roar echoed in my mind, so loud and clear it was as if it were right there in the room with me. I spun around, half expecting to see the monster looming in my tiny bathroom. But there was nothing, of course, there was never anything. I slid down to the floor, my back against the cold tile wall, and buried my face in my hands. The world's refusal to believe me, to even consider the possibility of what I'd experienced, was almost as terrifying as the attack itself. I was alone with this knowledge, alone with the memory of that horrific night, alone with the guilt of surviving when my friends had not. As I sat there, trembling and exhausted, a thought began to form. If no one would believe me, if there was no evidence to support my claims, then I would have to find proof myself. I would have to go back into those woods, back to the scene of the attack, and find something, anything, that would validate my story. The very idea of returning to that place filled me with dread. But what choice did I have? I couldn't live like this, doubted and dismissed, forever questioning my own sanity. I had to know the truth, had to find a way to make others see it too. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and began to research. Bigfoot sightings, cryptozoology, anything that might give me a clue, a starting point. As the first light of dawn began to filter through my window, I made my decision. I would go back. I would find the truth. The dim light of my laptop screen illuminated the cluttered mess of my apartment. Stacks of books on cryptozoology, folklore, and unexplained phenomena surrounded me. My walls were covered with maps of the local forests, marked with every reported Bigfoot sighting in the area over the past century. I hadn't slept in days, my eyes bloodshot and my hands shaking as I scrolled through yet another obscure forum discussing Bigfoot encounters. There has to be something, I muttered to myself, rubbing my tired eyes. Some connection, some pattern I'm missing. I'd been at this for weeks now, diving deeper and deeper into the world of Bigfoot research. Every spare moment was spent poring over old legends, analyzing grainy photos, and dissecting eyewitness accounts. I was desperate to find anything that could validate my own horrific experience, anything that could prove I wasn't losing my mind. A knock at my door startled me out of my research-induced trance. I opened it to find my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, looking concerned. "Jake, dear, I haven't seen you in days. Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes taking in my disheveled appearance and the chaos behind me. I forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. Just busy with a project." She didn't look convinced. "You know, if you ever need to talk..." "Thank you." I cut her off, perhaps too abruptly. "But I'm really okay, just have a lot of work to do." As I closed the door, I caught a glimpse of her worried expression. I knew what everyone in town thought of me now. The crazy guy obsessed with Bigfoot. But they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. Night fell, and I found myself once again at the edge of the forest. Despite the terror that gripped me every time I approached these woods, I couldn't stay away. I had to find proof, had to find some trace of the creature that had destroyed my life and taken my friends. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness as I made my way along now familiar paths. Every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need for vindication. "Where are you?" I whispered into the darkness. "Show yourself, damn you!" But as always, the forest remained silent, offering no answers, no proof of the horror I had witnessed. Hours passed, and I found myself back at the clearing where our campsite had been. I sank to my knees, exhaustion and despair washing over me. My health had been deteriorating rapidly over the past weeks. I'd lost weight, dark circles permanently etched under my eyes. The need to prove the creature's existence had consumed me entirely, leaving little room for self-care or rational thought. As I knelt there, the events of that terrible night played out in my mind once again. The creature's guttural roars echoed in my ears, so vivid I instinctively looked around, half expecting to see its massive form emerging from the shadows. The image of my friends' lifeless bodies flashed before my eyes, and I choked back a sob. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the empty clearing. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry no one believes me." The sound of voices in the distance snapped me back to reality. Flashlight beams danced through the trees, accompanied by calls of, "Jake, are you out here?" Panic seized me. I couldn't face them, couldn't bear to see the mixture of pity and skepticism in their eyes. I scrambled to my feet and fled deeper into the woods, my heart pounding. As I ran, I could hear snippets of conversation carried on the night air. "Becoming a real problem. Needs help. Can't keep coming out here looking for monsters." Their words stung, but they only fueled my determination. I'd show them. I'd find proof if it was the last thing I did. Days blurred together. I barely ate, barely slept. When I did manage to close my eyes, nightmares of the attack jolted me awake, leaving me drenched in sweat and trembling. I overheard whispers in town when I ventured out for supplies. "There goes the crazy guy from the woods. Poor thing, he's really lost it. Someone should do something before he hurts himself." Their taunts and skepticism should have discouraged me, but instead, they drove me harder. I'd prove them all wrong. I'd vindicate myself and honor the memory of my friends. One evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing my notes for the 1,000th time, a memory surfaced. Something the creature had done. A behavior I hadn't noticed before in my panic. Could it be a clue? A way to track it? Excitement coursed through me, giving me a burst of energy I hadn't felt in weeks. I grabbed my gear and headed for the door, ready for another night of searching. As I reached for the handle, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. Gaunt, wild-eyed, with a scraggly beard and unkempt hair. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was I really on the verge of a breakthrough? Or had I truly lost my mind, as everyone seemed to think? The memory of the creature's roar, the image of my friends' bodies flashed through my mind once more. No, I wasn't crazy. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and I would prove it, no matter the cost. With renewed determination, I stepped out into the night, ready to face the darkness once more. The darkness of my bedroom pressed in around me, suffocating and oppressive. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my eyes burning with exhaustion but unable to close. The only sound in the empty room was my own ragged breathing, each inhale a painful reminder that I was still alive when my friends were not. "Just sleep," I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. "You need to sleep." But sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, every time I let my guard down, the memories came flooding back. The creature's roar, the sickening crunch of bones, the terror in my friends' eyes as they realized their fate. It was all there, waiting for me in the darkness behind my eyelids. A sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me jolt upright, my heart pounding. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the streetlight filtering through my curtains. For a moment, in my sleep-deprived state, I could have sworn I saw the hulking form of the creature, its massive arms reaching for me. "It's not real," I muttered, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes. "It can't be here. It can't." But the rational part of my brain, the part that insisted monsters weren't real, was growing quieter with each passing day. How could I trust logic and reason when I had seen the impossible with my own eyes? I stumbled out of bed, my legs shaky beneath me. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m., another sleepless night. I made my way to the bathroom, wincing at my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, a scraggly beard, hollow cheeks. I barely recognized myself anymore. As I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shock some alertness into my system, a memory surfaced. Not of the attack itself, but of the aftermath. The disbelief in the sheriff's eyes, the way my friends' families had turned away from me, unable or unwilling to hear the truth. They think I'm crazy, I said to my reflection. Maybe I am. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Was that worse than the alternative? To believe that I had imagined it all? That my mind had conjured up some elaborate delusion to explain the disappearance of my friends? No, I couldn't let myself think that way. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The pain in my arm, still not fully healed, was testament to that. I stumbled back to bed, knowing sleep wouldn't come, but too exhausted to do anything else. As I lay there, the shadows on the wall seemed to grow more menacing, twisting into familiar shapes, a clawed hand here, a hulking shoulder there. My eyes drifted closed against my will, and immediately, the nightmares began. I was back in the forest, the creature looming over me. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, piercing through me, seeing into my very soul. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Its massive hand reached for me, claws extended. I jolted awake with a scream caught in my throat, drenched in sweat. My heart was racing, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. The familiar surroundings of my bedroom slowly came into focus, but the terror of the dream lingered. "No more," I gasped, pushing myself out of bed. I can't do this anymore." I paced the small confines of my apartment, too afraid to go back to sleep, too exhausted to do anything productive. The creature haunted me, awake or asleep. There was no escaping it. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through my windows, I found myself huddled in the corner of my living room, a baseball bat clutched in my trembling hands. I hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. The fear that the creature would return, that it would find me here and finish what it had started in the forest, was overwhelming. "It's not coming," I told myself over and over. "It's not real. It can't hurt you here." But the words rang hollow. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The creature was real. And who was to say it couldn't follow me here, couldn't hunt me down to silence the only witness to its existence? A knock at my door made me jump, the bat clattering to the floor. For a moment, wild panic gripped me. Had it come for me? But then a familiar voice called out, "Jake, it's Mrs. Henderson. Are you all right in there?" I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm myself. I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. Just not feeling well." There was a pause, and I could almost feel her concern radiating through the door. "Jake, dear, I'm worried about you. We all are. Maybe you should talk to someone." "I said I'm fine," I snapped, immediately regretting my harsh tone. "I'm sorry, I need to be alone right now." I heard her sigh, then her footsteps retreating down the hall. Guilt washed over me, adding to the tumult of emotions swirling in my chest. I knew she meant well, knew that everyone who looked at me with pity in their eyes was just trying to help. But how could I explain to them what I was going through? How could I make them understand the terror that gripped me every waking moment, the memories that refused to fade? As the day wore on, I found myself reliving that night over and over. The laughter around the campfire, the peace of the forest, the sudden, horrifying appearance of the creature. Every detail was etched into my memory with painful clarity. The sound of bones crushing under its massive hands, the terror in my friend's eyes, the hopelessness I felt as I realized we were powerless against this force of nature. I was a shell of the person I once was. The Jake who had gone into those woods, carefree, adventurous, surrounded by friends, was gone. In his place was this hollow-eyed, paranoid wreck, jumping at shadows and unable to sleep through the night. As evening fell once more, I found myself staring out the window at the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. Somewhere out there, the creature was still roaming free, and as long as it was out there, as long as the memory of that night haunted me, I knew I would never truly be free. The trauma of what I had witnessed, what I had survived, had fundamentally changed me. And as I stood there, watching the shadows lengthen and the darkness creep in, I wondered if I would ever find my way back to the person I used to be. Years had passed since that fateful night in the woods, but the memories remained as vivid as ever. The town that had once been my home had become a prison of whispers and sidelong glances. What started as pity had slowly morphed into scorn and derision. "There goes crazy Jake," they'd mutter as I passed by on my infrequent trips for supplies. "Still thinks he saw Bigfoot." I'd long since stopped trying to convince anyone of the truth. What was the point? They'd made up their minds, and no amount of pleading or explaining could change that. So I retreated, becoming a recluse in my own little corner of the world. My apartment became my sanctuary and my cell, the only place where I didn't have to face the disbelief and judgment of others. But even in the relative safety of my four walls, I couldn't escape the knowledge that the creature was still out there. Somewhere in those dark woods, it was lurking, waiting. Every rustle of leaves in the wind, every creak of a floorboard at night sent my heart racing. I'd covered my windows with thick curtains, unable to bear the sight of the forest looming in the distance, a constant reminder of what I'd experienced. "It's still out there," I muttered to myself one evening, pacing the worn path in my living room carpet. "They don't believe me, but I know it's out there." The loneliness was suffocating at times. I missed my friends, missed the life I'd had before. But how could I move on? How could I forget when I knew the truth? The creature was real, and as long as it roamed free, no one was truly safe. As night fell, I found myself drawn to the window despite my fear. I parted the curtains just a crack, peering out at the moonlit landscape. The forest looked peaceful from a distance, but I knew better. I knew the horrors that lurked beneath those tranquil boughs. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet night. A roar, distant but unmistakable, echoed across the valley. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back from the window, my legs giving out beneath me. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no. It couldn't be. After all these years? Why now? Why here?" But there was no mistaking that bone-chilling sound. It was the same roar that had haunted my nightmares for years, the same terrifying bellow that had preceded the deaths of my friends. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Would they even believe me? Or would this just be another nail in the coffin of my credibility? I was paralyzed with indecision and fear, my body refusing to move, even as my instincts screamed at me to run, to hide. With shaking hands, I managed to pull myself up and peer out the window once more. And there, at the edge of the forest, I saw it. The massive, hulking form of the creature, its silhouette unmistakable in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat as memories of that terrible night came flooding back. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, seemed to. The creature stood there motionless, and I found myself wondering if it somehow knew I was watching. Did it remember me? Had it come back to finish what it had started all those years ago? Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped back into the darkness of the forest. I watched, helpless and terrified, as it disappeared among the trees, leaving no trace of its presence save for the hammering of my heart and the cold sweat on my brow. As the adrenaline faded, I sank to the floor, my back against the wall. Tears streamed down my face, years of pent-up emotion finally breaking free. It was real. It was all real, and no one would ever believe me. "What do I do now?" I asked the empty room, my voice barely a whisper. The sight of the creature had shaken loose something inside me. For years I'd been living in a state of suspended animation, trapped between the trauma of the past and the disbelief of the present. But now, with the undeniable proof of the creature's continued existence, I realized I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't stay here, in this town that had become a prison of disbelief and judgment. I couldn't live my life always looking over my shoulder, always wondering when the creature might return. But where could I go? How could I escape the shadow of that night when it lived inside my very soul? As dawn broke, casting a pale light through my curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't run from the memories, couldn't erase what had happened, but I could choose how to live with them. I could find a way to honor the memory of my friends, to use what I'd learned to help others, even if they never believed my story. With trembling hands, I began to pack a bag. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan beyond getting out of this town and away from the forest that had taken so much from me. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of something that might have been hope. As I stood at my door, bag in hand, I took one last look around the apartment that had been my refuge and my prison. The walls were covered with maps and notes, evidence of years spent trying to prove what I knew to be true. I wouldn't be taking any of it with me. It was time to let go, to find a new purpose. I'll never forget, I promised, to the empty room, to the memory of my friends, to the creature that had changed my life forever. But I can't let it control me anymore. With that, I stepped out into the early morning light, closing the door on one chapter of my life and stepping uncertainly into the next. The creature's shadow would always loom over me, a constant reminder of the horror that no one would ever believe. But maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to live in spite of it, to reclaim some small part of the life I'd lost that terrible night in the woods. As I walked away from my old life, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly an escape. The creature was still out there, and the truth of what I'd experienced would always be with me. But for now, for this moment, I was taking the first step towards something new, and that I realized was its own kind of victory. The sun was setting as I pitched my tent in the secluded campsite, excited for a night under the stars. The crisp evening air and the scent of pine trees filled my senses, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of tranquility wash over me. This was exactly the kind of solitary retreat I needed after the stresses of the past few weeks. I started a campfire and settled in with a book, determined to enjoy the peaceful solitude. The crackling flames cast a warm glow over my temporary abode, and I found myself losing track of time as I became absorbed in the pages before me. For a while, it felt as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving me in my own serene little bubble. Suddenly, a strange noise in the distance made me pause and look up from my book. My brow furrowed as I strained to listen, trying to determine the source of the disturbance. It could have been the wind rustling the trees, or perhaps some small woodland creature scurrying through the underbrush. I told myself not to be so jumpy, that I was simply letting my imagination run wild in the darkness. My heart raced as I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching my tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end and a cold chill ran down my spine. Whatever was out there was massive, far too large to be a mere animal. Clutching my flashlight tightly, I slowly unzipped the tent flap, peering out into the shadows. Peering out, I caught a glimpse of a massive, hairy figure disappearing back into the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. It couldn't be. Bigfoot? The legendary creature of the forest, the subject of so many fantastical tales and urban legends. Surely, I must be hallucinating. Or perhaps my eyes were simply playing tricks on me in the dark. I remained frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of that towering ape-like figure was seared into my mind, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had suddenly engulfed me. Whatever that thing was, it was real. And it was out there, lurking in the darkness. Gathering my courage, I stepped out of the tent, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam of light revealed nothing but the familiar sight of the forest, and I began to question whether I had truly seen what I thought I had seen. Maybe it was just a bear or some other large animal. Surely Bigfoot couldn't be real. Yet a nagging feeling of unease persisted. I couldn't shake the impression that I was being watched, that something was out there, observing me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hastily, I returned to the safety of my tent, zipping it up tight and securing the entrance. As I sat in the dimly lit space, my mind raced with 1,000 different scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. What if that thing, whatever it was, decided to attack? I had no way to defend myself, no means of escape. The thought of being trapped at the mercy of some monstrous creature sent a shiver down my spine. I cursed myself for venturing out into the wilderness alone, for letting my guard down and succumbing to the allure of solitude. Night fell, and the forest grew silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of the trees. I huddled in my sleeping bag, straining my ears for any sign of movement outside. Every creak and snap had me on high alert, my imagination running wild with visions of the Bigfoot, its glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws, lurking just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. As the hours ticked by, exhaustion began to set in, but I refused to let my guard down. Sleep, I knew, would only make me vulnerable, and I couldn't risk it, not with that creature out there. I had to stay vigilant, to be ready for whatever might come. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, and just as the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I heard it. A bone-chilling roar that echoed through the forest, sending a wave of pure terror coursing through my body. It was real, all of it. The Bigfoot was out there, and it was coming for me. Scrambling to my feet, I frantically began packing up my gear, my hands shaking with fear. I had to get out of here, had to find a way to safety. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was not alone in the wilderness. The air seemed to thicken with tension, and a heavy, oppressive silence settled over the campsite. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the faint glow of the campfire. My eyes strained to make out any movement, any sign of the creature I had glimpsed earlier. But the forest remained eerily still, the only sound the faint crackling of the dying embers. A wave of dread washed over me as the realization sank in. I was being watched. Somewhere, out there in the shadows, that massive, hairy figure was lurking, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its every muscle coiled and ready to pounce. Mustering my courage, I stepped outside to investigate, clutching a flashlight and a hunting knife. The cool night air sent a shiver through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that at any moment the Bigfoot would come crashing out of the trees. Cautiously, I swept the beam of my flashlight across the campsite, searching for any sign of the creature. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, taunting me with their mysteries. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept forward, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" The only response was the eerie silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the knife, my eyes darting from one dark corner to the next. The eerie silence was shattered by a bone-chilling roar that sent shivers down my spine. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, a deep, guttural bellow that seemed to reverberate through my very soul. It was a cry of pure animalistic rage, a challenge to any who dared to intrude on its domain. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to flee this place and escape the wrath of the Bigfoot. But my legs felt rooted to the spot, my mind paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. The roar echoed through the trees, growing fainter as it faded into the distance. But the message was clear. The creature was out there, and it was not happy with my presence. I frantically searched the darkness but saw nothing, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Where was it? Had it retreated, or was it simply waiting, biding its time until it could strike again? The uncertainty was almost worse than the encounter itself, the constant fear of the unknown weighing heavily on my mind. Swinging the beam of my flashlight back and forth, I scanned the perimeter of the campsite. Every shadow a potential threat. My grip on the knife tightened, my knuckles turning white as I steeled myself for the inevitable confrontation. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling. "Show yourself." But the forest remained silent, the darkness impenetrable. Whatever the Bigfoot was planning, it was keeping its distance, toying with me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Hurrying back to my tent, I sealed the entrance and huddled inside, praying I was safe. The thin fabric of the tent felt woefully inadequate against the threat that lurked outside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was just waiting for me to let my guard down. I fumbled in the darkness, searching for my phone, desperate to call for help. But as I pulled it from my pocket, the screen remained dark, the battery drained. Panic began to set in, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. "No, no, no," I whispered, frantically trying to power on the device. "Come on, work." But it was no use. I was alone, trapped in the wilderness with no way to call for help. The Bigfoot was out there, lurking in the shadows, and I had no means of escape. Clutching the hunting knife tightly, I huddled in the corner of the tent, my eyes darting from one side to the other. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slow, and with each passing moment the sense of dread grew stronger. I knew that eventually the Bigfoot would return, and when it did, I would be powerless to stop it. All I could do was wait and pray that I would somehow find the strength to survive the encounter. As the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I steeled myself for what was to come, knowing that the true horror of this night had only just begun. The first rays of dawn had barely begun to peek through the trees when I was jolted awake by a thunderous crash. My tent shook violently, the fabric tearing apart as if it were made of paper. In an instant, my world turned into a nightmare. "What's happening?" I screamed, my voice hoarse with terror. But there was no one to answer, no one except the monstrous creature that was now tearing into my shelter. I scrambled to get out, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. But before I could make my escape, a massive clawed hand reached in and grabbed me by the leg. The pain was immediate and intense, like nothing I'd ever felt before. "No! Let go!" I shrieked, my fingers clawing at the ground as I was dragged backwards. The creature's grip was like iron, its claws digging deep into my flesh. I could feel warm blood trickling down my leg, and the realization that this was real, that I was being attacked by something that shouldn't exist, hit me like a punch to the gut. In a moment of desperate clarity, I remembered the hunting knife I'd kept close throughout the night. With trembling hands, I reached for it, my fingers closing around the handle, just as I was about to be pulled completely out of the tent. "Get off me," I yelled, twisting my body to face my attacker. And there it was. The Bigfoot, its massive frame loomed over me, blocking out what little light there was. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, filled with a primal hunger that sent chills down my spine. Matted fur covered its body, and the stench of wet earth and decay filled my nostrils. Without hesitation, I slashed at the hand gripping my leg. The blade connected, drawing blood and causing the creature to howl in pain and rage. Its cry was deafening, a sound that seemed to shake the very trees around us. The Bigfoot's grip loosened for just a moment, but it was enough. I wrenched my leg free and scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain shooting up from my wounds. There was no time to think, no time to plan. All I could do was run, and run I did. I fled into the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Behind me, I could hear the creature's deafening roars, punctuated by the sound of trees snapping like twigs as it gave chase. "Help!" I screamed as I ran, though I knew there was no one around to hear me. "Someone, please help!" The forest was a blur of shadows and reaching branches. I stumbled over roots and rocks, each misstep threatening to send me tumbling to the ground. But the fear of what was behind me kept me going, pushing my body beyond its limits. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction had been lost in the chaos of the attack. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, Had to put as much distance between myself and that monster as possible. The roars behind me grew fainter, but I didn't dare slow down. For all I knew, the creature was simply toying with me, waiting for me to tire before closing in for the kill. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of sheer terror. But eventually, my body began to give out. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, and the pain from my wounds was becoming unbearable. Gasping for breath, I stumbled into a small clearing. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, panting heavily. "Oh God," I whispered, my voice trembling. What was that thing? As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full extent of my injuries became apparent. I looked down at my leg, wincing at the sight of the deep gashes left by the creature's powerful claws. Blood soaked through my torn pants, and every movement sent waves of pain through my body. I knew I couldn't stay here. The Bigfoot was still out there, hunting me down. But I needed a moment to catch my breath to try and make sense of what had happened. With shaking hands, I tore strips from my shirt, using them to bind my wounds as best I could. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. As I worked, my mind raced. How was this possible? Bigfoot was supposed to be a myth, a legend told around campfires. But what I had seen, what had attacked me, was all too real. Its strength, its speed, its sheer size. It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and I froze. Was it back? Had it found me already? Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford to lose my head now. I had to keep moving, had to find help. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I pushed myself to my feet. My injured leg nearly buckled under my weight, but I managed to stay upright. I scanned the clearing, desperately searching for any sign of which way to go. That's when I saw it. A small opening in the rocks, barely visible in the dim light. A cave. It wasn't much, but it might provide some shelter. A place to hide until I could figure out my next move. Limping as fast as I could, I made my way towards the cave entrance. Every step was agony, and I could feel fresh blood seeping through my makeshift bandages. But the fear of what lurked in the forest pushed me onward. As I reached the cave, another roar echoed through the trees, closer this time. My heart leapt into my throat, and I scrambled inside without hesitation. The cave was small and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. But it was shelter, and right now, that was all that mattered. I crawled deeper into the cave, trying to put as much distance between myself and the entrance as possible. In the darkness, I felt my way along the rough stone walls, praying that I wouldn't encounter any of the cave's other inhabitants. Finally, I reached what felt like the back of the cave. I huddled there, shivering in the darkness, straining my ears for any sound of approach. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was pleading with. "Please let me survive this." Time seemed to stand still as I waited in that damp, dark cave. Every sound, every shift in the air had me on edge, certain that at any moment the Bigfoot would appear at the entrance, ready to finish what it had started. But as the minutes ticked by, and no monstrous figure appeared, I began to hope. Maybe I had lost it. Maybe it had given up the chase. Just as I was starting to relax, a sudden crash outside the cave sent me scrambling deeper into the darkness. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. And then I saw it. The massive form of the Bigfoot loomed in the cave entrance, its glowing eyes scanning the interior. I held my breath, willing myself to become invisible, praying that the creature wouldn't find me. The Bigfoot let out a frustrated growl, its hot breath visible in the cool air of the cave. It took a step forward, and I was certain that this was the end. But then miraculously, it turned and left, disappearing back into the forest. I remained frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. Was it really gone, or was this just another trick, waiting for me to let my guard down? As the minutes ticked by and the creature didn't return, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. but I knew I couldn't stay here forever. The Bigfoot was still out there, and it would return. I had to find a way to safety, had to get help. Mustering what little strength I had left, I began to make my way out of the cave. Every movement was cautious, every sound setting my nerves on edge, but I knew that this might be my only chance to escape. As I emerged from the cave, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. In the growing light, the forest seemed less menacing, but I knew the danger was far from over. With a deep breath, I set out once more, limping through the underbrush. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. Somewhere out there was safety, civilization, people who could help me. But even as I pushed forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the Bigfoot was still out there, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. This nightmare was far from over, and I knew that the memory of this night would haunt me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. I ran until I could no longer feel my legs, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. The forest was a blur of shadows and reaching branches, each step a gamble between escape and disaster. Finally, my body gave out, and I collapsed in a small clearing, panting heavily. The cool earth pressed against my face as I lay there, trying to catch my breath and gather my wits. Got to keep moving, I gasped between breaths, but my body refused to cooperate. As the adrenaline began to subside, the pain in my leg became impossible to ignore. Grimacing, I pushed myself up to examine the injury. The sight of it made my stomach churn. Deep gashes, left by the creature's powerful claws, ran down my calf. Blood seeped through my torn pants, and the surrounding skin was already starting to bruise. "Oh God," I whispered, gingerly touching the wound. The slightest contact sent waves of pain shooting up my leg. "This is bad. This is really bad." I tore off a strip of my shirt, using it to bind the wound as best I could. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As I worked, my mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. The attack, the creature, it was all real. Bigfoot wasn't just a myth or a legend. It was out there, and it had nearly killed me. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and I froze. Dread filled me as I realized the beast was still out there hunting me down. It hadn't given up. Maybe it never would. "Stay calm," I told myself, though my racing heart betrayed my fear. "Think. You need to find shelter." I scanned the clearing, desperately searching for any sign of safety. That's when I spotted it. A small opening in a nearby rock face. A cave. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option I had. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I pushed myself to my feet. Every step was agony, but the fear of what lurked in the forest pushed me forward. I limped across the clearing, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the monstrous figure of Bigfoot emerging from the trees at any moment. As I reached the cave entrance, another roar echoed through the forest, closer this time. My heart leapt into my throat, and I scrambled inside without hesitation. The cave was small and damp, barely large enough for me to crawl into. But it was shelter, and right now, that was all that mattered. I crawled deeper into the cave, my injured leg dragging behind me. The rough stone scraped against my hands and knees, but I pushed on, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the entrance as possible. "Please," I whispered to the darkness. "Please let this be enough." Finally, I reached what felt like the back of the cave. I huddled there, shivering in the darkness, straining my ears for any sound of approach. My heart pounded in my ears so loud I was afraid the creature might hear it. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I waited in that damp, dark cave. Every sound, every shift in the air had me on edge. I imagined the Bigfoot's massive form filling the cave entrance, its glowing eyes scanning the darkness, searching for me. "It's not real," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. "It can't be real. Things like this don't happen." But the throbbing pain in my leg was a constant reminder that this nightmare was all too real. I gingerly felt the makeshift bandage, wincing as my fingers came away sticky with blood. The wound was still bleeding, and I knew I needed proper medical attention. But how could I get help when that thing was still out there? A sudden crash outside the cave sent me pressing further against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. I held my breath, certain that this was the end. The Bigfoot had found me, and there was nowhere left to run. Heavy footsteps approached the cave entrance. I could hear the creature's labored breathing, smell its musky animal scent. It was so close. Too close. "Please," I mouthed silently, squeezing my eyes shut. "Please don't find me." The footsteps paused at the entrance of the cave. I could feel the creature's presence, an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to fill the small space. For a moment that felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, miraculously, the footsteps began to move away. The Bigfoot let out a frustrated growl that echoed through the cave, but it was growing fainter. It was leaving. I remained frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. Was it really gone? Or was this just another trick waiting for me to let my guard down? As the minutes ticked by and the creature didn't return, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly, but I knew I couldn't stay here forever. The Bigfoot was still out there, and it would return. I had to find a way to safety, had to get help. My leg throbbed, a constant reminder of the danger I was in. I knew that if I didn't get medical attention soon, the wound could become infected. But the thought of venturing back out into the forest where that creature was still hunting filled me with terror. "You can do this," I whispered to myself, trying to summon what little courage I had left. "You have to do this." Slowly, painfully, I began to inch my way towards the cave entrance. Every movement sent waves of pain through my injured leg, but I gritted my teeth and pushed on. As I neared the opening, I paused, listening intently for any sign of the Bigfoot's return. The forest outside was quiet. Too quiet. It was as if all the normal sounds of nature had been silenced by the presence of the monster that now roamed these woods. Taking a deep breath, I peered out of the cave. The first light of dawn was breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. In the growing light, the woods seemed less menacing, but I knew the danger was far from over. With trembling hands, I pulled myself out of the cave. My injured leg nearly gave out as I put weight on it, and I had to lean against the rock face to keep from falling. "Okay," I muttered, scanning the surrounding forest. Which way? I had no idea where I was or which direction would lead me to safety, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Choosing a direction at random, I began to limp forward, each step a battle against pain and exhaustion. As I moved through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that somewhere out there, hidden among the trees, the Bigfoot was waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The eerie silence of the cave was shattered by a sudden crash outside. My heart leapt into my throat as I scrambled deeper into the darkness, desperate to conceal my presence. The sound of heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves under massive feet grew louder, and I knew with sickening certainty that the Bigfoot had returned. I pressed myself against the damp cave wall, willing my body to meld with the rock. The pain in my leg was excruciating, but I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound. Even the slightest noise could give away my position. Then I saw it. The massive form of the Bigfoot loomed in the cave entrance, blotting out what little light had been filtering in. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, scanning the interior of the cave. I watched in horror, my breath caught in my throat, as those piercing eyes swept back and forth. "Please," I mouthed silently, my eyes squeezed shut. "Please don't find me." The creature's hot, rank breath filled the small space. I could hear it sniffing the air, searching for my scent. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would hear it. Every muscle in my body was tensed, ready to flee, though I knew there was nowhere to run. As the Bigfoot took a step further into the cave, I pressed myself even harder against the wall. A small stone dislodged under my hand, clattering to the ground with what seemed like deafening loudness in the tense silence. The creature's head snapped towards the sound. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the Bigfoot stared in my direction. I could feel its gaze burning into me, and I was certain that at any moment it would lunge forward and drag me out of my hiding place. But then, miraculously, it turned away. The Bigfoot let out a frustrated growl that reverberated through the cave, shaking loose small pebbles from the ceiling. It paced back and forth at the entrance, clearly agitated. "Go away," I whispered, so quietly I could barely hear myself. "Please, just go away." As if in answer to my plea, the creature turned and stomped out of the cave. Its heavy footsteps grew fainter as it moved away, but I didn't dare move. I knew it would return. This wasn't over. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in that position, barely breathing, straining my ears for any sound of the Bigfoot's return. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The pain in my leg had dulled to a constant throb, and my muscles ached from the tension. Finally, when I could no longer bear the stillness, I began to inch forward. Every movement was agonizingly slow, every sound amplified in the quiet of the cave. As I neared the entrance, I paused, listening intently for any sign of the creature. The forest outside was eerily quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if all of nature was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Taking a deep breath, I peered out of the cave. The sun had risen higher now, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. There was no sign of the Bigfoot, but I knew it couldn't have gone far. "Okay," I muttered to myself, trying to summon what little courage I had left. "It's now or never." Mustering my remaining strength, I carefully made my way out of the cave. My injured leg protested with every movement, but the fear of being trapped if the Bigfoot returned gave me the adrenaline boost I needed. As I emerged into the open, I scanned the surrounding forest frantically. Which way should I go? I had no idea where I was or which direction might lead to safety. But staying here wasn't an option. I chose a direction at random and began to limp forward as quickly as I could. Every step was agony, and I had to bite back cries of pain. The forest seemed to close in around me, every shadow potentially hiding the monstrous creature that had attacked me. "Just keep moving," I told myself, my voice a ragged whisper. "One foot in front of the other, you can do this." I don't know how long I stumbled through the woods. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green twilight under the trees. My leg was on fire, and I could feel fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. But the fear of what lurked behind me kept me going. As I pushed through a dense thicket, my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there gasping, the world spinning around me. "Get up," I wheezed, struggling to push myself to my feet. "You have to get up." That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. My blood ran cold as I turned my head, dreading what I might see. There, not 20 feet away, stood the Bigfoot. It was even more terrifying in the daylight. Matted fur covered its massive frame, and its eyes burned with an inhuman intelligence and rage. It took a step forward, leaves crunching under its enormous feet. "No," I gasped, scrambling backwards. "No, no, no!" The creature let out a roar that shook the trees, and I knew that this was it. There was nowhere left to run, no strength left to fight. As the Bigfoot charged towards me, I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as I felt the rush of air from the creature's approach, there was a loud crack. My eyes flew open to see a massive tree branch crashing down between me and the Bigfoot. The creature leapt back, momentarily startled. It was all the opening I needed. Ignoring the screaming pain in my leg, I pushed myself to my feet and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear the Bigfoot's roars of frustration and the sound of trees being smashed aside as it gave chase. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. All my focus was on putting one foot in front of the other, on finding a way out of this nightmare. As I burst through another thicket, I saw something that made my heart leap with hope. A road. A narrow dirt logging road, but a road nonetheless. And where there was a road, there had to be people. With the last of my strength, I staggered onto the road and began to follow it. The Bigfoot's roars were growing fainter now, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity to strike. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw something that nearly made me weep with relief. A small diner, its neon open sign a beacon of hope in the wilderness, civilization, safety. Limping as fast as I could, I made my way towards the diner. As I reached the door, I cast one last glance back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a large, dark shape moving among the trees, but then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever really been there at all. With a shaking hand, I pushed open the door of the diner, the bell above tinkling cheerfully. As I stumbled inside, leaving a trail of blood and dirt, I knew that my ordeal was far from over. But for now, at least, I had escaped. I had survived. I ran for what felt like hours, my injured leg throbbing with every step. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees and shadows that threatened to swallow me whole. My lungs burned and my vision blurred with exhaustion and pain, but the memory of the Bigfoot's roar kept me moving forward. Just keep going, I gasped between ragged breaths, willing my battered body to continue. The sun had climbed high in the sky by the time I stumbled onto a narrow, winding road. The sight of it nearly brought me to my knees with relief. Civilization. A way out of this nightmare. I limped along the road, my eyes constantly darting back to the tree line, half expecting to see the massive, hairy figure of the Bigfoot emerging from the shadows. But the forest remained still, almost mockingly peaceful in the afternoon light. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted a small building in the distance. As I drew closer, I could make out a faded sign. Mabel's Diner, open 24 hours. My heart leapt with hope. Help. Finally, help. Summoning the last of my strength, I staggered towards the diner. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as I burst in, a stark contrast to the horror I'd just escaped. "Please," I croaked, my voice hoarse from hours of running and screaming. "I need help. You have to call someone." The diner was empty save for an older man behind the counter, presumably the owner. He stared at me, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. I must have been quite a sight. Clothes torn and bloody, covered in dirt and leaves, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. "Good Lord, son," the man exclaimed, coming out from behind the counter. "What happened to you?" I collapsed into a nearby booth, my injured leg finally giving out. It was Bigfoot, I panted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "In the forest, it attacked me. You have to call for help, it's still out there." The owner's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. He eyed me warily, as if trying to decide whether I was dangerous or just delusional. "Bigfoot?" he repeated slowly. "Son, I think you might have hit your head out there. Let me call you an ambulance." "No," I interrupted, frustration and fear making my voice sharp. "You don't understand. It was real. I saw it. It tried to kill me. We need to call the police, warn people." The man's face hardened. "Now listen here," he said firmly. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but Bigfoot ain't real. You're obviously hurt, and I'm happy to call you some medical help. But I won't have you spreading crazy stories and scaring folks around here." "It's not a story," I insisted, my voice rising with desperation. "Look at my leg. Look at these wounds. Do you think I did this to myself?" The owner glanced at my injured leg, his brow furrowing. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he shook his head. "Could have been a bear," he said dismissively. "Or you got yourself tangled up in some brambles. But it wasn't no Bigfoot. Now do you want me to call an ambulance or not?" I stared at him, feeling a wave of hopelessness wash over me. He didn't believe me. No one would believe me. How could they? If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. Please, I tried one last time, my voice cracking. Just call the police. Let me talk to them. They need to know what's out there. The owner's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. I'm sorry, son. I can't be party to spreading panic based on a delusion. Now, I'm going to call you that ambulance. As he turned to reach for the phone, a movement outside the window caught my eye. My blood ran cold as I saw a large, dark shape moving among the trees across the road. It was only there for a second before it disappeared, but I knew. It had followed me. There! I shouted, pointing frantically. Did you see it? It's out there! The owner turned to look, but by then the shape was gone. He sighed, looking at me with a mixture of pity and exasperation. There's nothing out there, son, he said gently. Look, why don't you just sit tight, and I'll get you some water while we wait for the ambulance. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't risk the Bigfoot finding me here, couldn't risk it hurting anyone else because of me. And I couldn't bear the look of disbelief in the owner's eyes, the unspoken accusation of insanity. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself to my feet. I'm sorry, I muttered. I have to go. Thank you for trying to help. Ignoring the owner's protests, I limped towards the door. As I stepped back out into the afternoon sun, I cast one last glance at the forest. The trees stood silent and innocuous, betraying no sign of the horror that lurked within. Be careful out there, the owner called after me, and get yourself to a hospital. I didn't respond. What could I say? How could I explain the terror that gripped me, the certainty that the nightmare wasn't over? With no other choice, I started walking down the road, away from the diner and the judging eyes of its owner. My leg throbbed with every step, and exhaustion weighed heavily on me. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find someone who would believe me, someone who could help. As I walked, the memory of the Bigfoot's attack played over and over in my mind. The glowing eyes, the massive claws, the inhuman roar. It was real, I knew it was real, but how could I prove it? How could I make anyone understand the danger that was out there? The road stretched out before me, seemingly endless. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back. Couldn't return to that forest where death lurked in the shadows. All I could do was keep moving forward, haunted by the memory of the creature that had nearly killed me, and the terrifying knowledge that it was still out there. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sun was setting as I limped into the small town of Pine Creek, my body aching and my mind reeling from the horrors I had experienced. The quaint main street with its charming storefronts and friendly faces seemed surreal after the nightmare in the forest, but I knew I couldn't rest yet. I had to find someone who would listen, someone who would believe me. My first stop was the local police station, a small brick building at the end of the street. As I pushed open the door, the smell of coffee and paper filled my nostrils, a stark contrast to the earthy scent of the forest that still clung to my clothes. "Can I help you?" asked a young officer behind the desk, his eyes widening as he took in my disheveled appearance. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I need to report an attack," I said, my voice hoarse. "In the forest. It was Bigfoot." The officer's expression shifted from concern to skepticism in an instant. "Bigfoot?" he repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Sir, have you been drinking?" "No, you don't understand," I insisted, frustration building in my chest. "It was real. It attacked me. Look at my leg." I pulled up my torn pant leg, revealing the deep gashes left by the creature's claws. The officer's eyebrows shot up, but the skepticism didn't leave his face. "That looks nasty," he admitted. "But it could have been a bear or you could have fallen. There's no such thing as Bigfoot, sir." "Please," I begged. "Just listen to my story. Send someone to check the campsite. There has to be evidence." The officer sighed, clearly torn between his duty and his disbelief. "All right," he said finally. "Why don't you sit down and tell me exactly what happened?" For the next hour, I recounted every terrifying detail of my encounter. The officer listened patiently, taking notes, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad. "That's quite a story," he said carefully. "But without any concrete evidence, there's not much we can do. Are you sure you didn't imagine some of this? The forest can play tricks on your mind, especially if you were scared." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. They didn't believe me. No one was going to believe me. "Look," the officer continued, his voice softening. "Why don't you go get some rest? There's a motel just down the street. If you still want to pursue this in the morning, we can talk again." Defeated, I nodded and left the station. But as I stepped out into the cool night air, a new determination filled me. If they wouldn't believe me, I'd have to find proof myself. Despite my exhaustion and the pain in my leg, I made my way back to the forest. The campsite looked different in the fading light, shadows stretching between the trees like grasping fingers. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, my eyes darting around for any sign of the creature. "There has to be something," I muttered to myself, dropping to my knees to examine the ground. Footprints, hair, anything. As I scoured the area, my heart leapt. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a massive footprint. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, too large for a bear, too distinctly foot-shaped for any known animal. And nearby, caught on a low-hanging branch, were a few tufts of coarse, dark hair. "Yes," I exclaimed, carefully collecting the hair in a plastic bag I found in my torn backpack. "This is it. This is the proof." But as I stood up, triumphant, I felt the first drops of rain on my face. Within moments, it had turned into a downpour. To my horror, I watched as the rain washed away the footprint, erasing the evidence before my eyes. "No, no, no!" I cried, frantically trying to shield the print with my body. But it was too late. The soft earth turned to mud, obliterating any trace of the Bigfoot's passage. I clutched the bag of hair, my last piece of evidence, close to my chest. But even as I did, doubt began to creep in. Would this be enough? Would anyone believe that this hair came from an unknown creature? Or would they dismiss it as bear fur or some other mundane explanation? As I made my way back to town, soaked to the bone and shivering, frustration and despair threatened to overwhelm me. I knew what I had seen. I knew the danger that lurked in these woods. But how could I make anyone else understand? Back in my motel room, I spread the meager evidence out on the bed. The tufts of hair looked pitiful in the harsh light, certainly not enough to prove the existence of a mythical creature. I ran my hands through my hair, fighting back tears of frustration. "There has to be a way," I said to the empty room. "Someone has to believe me." As I paced the small room, my eyes fell on my laptop, miraculously undamaged in my backpack. An idea began to form. If the local authorities wouldn't listen, maybe I could find someone online who would take me seriously. There had to be researchers, enthusiasts, someone who would be willing to investigate. With renewed determination, I booted up the computer. As I waited for it to start, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was my last chance. If I couldn't find someone to believe me, to help me prove what had happened, then the truth would be lost forever. And worse, the creature would still be out there, a deadly secret lurking in the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath, flexing my fingers over the keyboard. It was time to tell my story to the world. Someone out there had to believe me. The morning light filtered through the dingy motel curtains, finding me hunched over my laptop, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. I had spent hours scouring the internet for local news contacts, my desperation growing with each passing minute. The memory of the Bigfoot's terrifying roar echoed in my mind, driving me forward despite my exhaustion. With trembling hands, I dialed the number for the local TV station, KPNW. "Hello, KPNW News Desk," a cheery voice answered. Hi, my name is Jessica, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. I have a story you need to hear. It's about a Bigfoot attack in the forest near Pine Creek. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, did you say Bigfoot attack? Yes, I insisted, the words tumbling out in a rush. I was camping, and this massive creature attacked me. I have injuries, and I found some hair samples. This is real, and people need to know about the danger. The receptionist's tone shifted from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. I see. Well, why don't you come down to the station this afternoon? One of our reporters can speak with you. Hope surged through me. Finally, someone was willing to listen. Hours later, I sat across from Sarah Chen, a young reporter with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. I recounted my harrowing experience, showing her the gashes on my leg and the tuft of coarse hair I had collected. Sarah listened attentively, taking notes. But as I finished my story, I saw the familiar look of doubt creep into her eyes. Jessica, she said gently, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. But without more concrete evidence, we can't run a story about a Bigfoot attack. It could cause unnecessary panic. But the hair, I started. Sarah shook her head. It could be from any number of animals. I'm sorry, but we need more than that to pursue this. Desperation clawed at my throat. Please, I begged, just send someone to investigate. There has to be more evidence out there. We'll look into it, Sarah said, but her tone made it clear she was simply humoring me. In the meantime, have you considered speaking with a counselor? Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us when we're scared. I left the station feeling deflated, the weight of disbelief pressing down on me. As I walked back to my motel, I overheard two people talking on the street. Did you hear about the girl claiming she saw Bigfoot? One said, chuckling. Yeah, sounds like someone had too much to drink in the woods, the other replied. Their laughter felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I quickened my pace, fighting back tears of frustration. Back in my room, I turned once again to my laptop. If traditional media wouldn't help, maybe I could find allies online. I found a popular Bigfoot enthusiast forum and began typing my story, hands shaking with a mix of fear and desperate hope. I know this sounds crazy, I wrote, but I swear every word is true. This creature was real and it's dangerous. I need help to prove it exists and warn others. I hit post and waited, refreshing the page obsessively. The first responses trickled in slowly. Pics or it didn't happen, one user wrote dismissively. Sounds like a typical bear encounter to me, another commented. But then, a glimmer of hope. I've heard similar stories from that area, a user named Bigfoot Truth 79 replied. Can you provide more details about the location? I'd be interested in investigating. My heart leapt. I quickly typed out a response, providing as much information as I could remember about the campsite and the surrounding area. As the day wore on, more responses flooded in. Some were skeptical, demanding evidence I couldn't provide. Others were supportive, sharing their own experiences or theories. A heated debate broke out in the comments, with users arguing over the plausibility of my story. I'm telling you, this matches the pattern of other sightings in the Pacific Northwest, one user insisted. Oh please, another retorted. It's always the same story. Scared camper, mysterious noises, no real proof. When will you people learn? I read each comment with growing frustration. Even here, among people who believed in Bigfoot's existence, my story was being picked apart and dismissed. As night fell, I found myself staring at the screen, tears of exhaustion and hopelessness streaming down my face. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading, leaving me feeling hollow and alone. A private message popped up from Bigfoot Truth 79. I believe you. I'm planning an expedition to the area next month. Would you be willing to guide us to the exact location? For a moment, hope flared in my chest. But then, the memory of the Bigfoot's terrifying roar filled my mind, and I felt my body go cold with fear. The thought of returning to those woods, of potentially facing that creature again, was too much to bear. With trembling fingers, I typed my response. I'm sorry, I can't go back there. It's too dangerous. Please be careful. I closed the laptop, feeling a crushing sense of defeat. Without concrete evidence, without the courage to return to the scene, my pleas for help had fallen on deaf ears. The truth of what had happened to me, the danger that lurked in those woods, would remain hidden. As I lay in the darkness of the motel room, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The Bigfoot was still out there, and I was the only one who knew the full extent of the danger. But without proof, without allies, how could I ever hope to make anyone understand? Sleep eluded me as my mind raced with unanswered questions and fears. What if the creature decided to venture closer to town? What if someone else fell victim to its savage attack? And how could I ever move on with my life, knowing what I knew, yet unable to do anything about it? As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to prove what had happened, to make people believe. Somehow, some way, I would uncover the truth about the monster in the woods. I had to. For my own sanity, and for the safety of others who might unknowingly wander into its deadly domain. The soft morning light filtering through the motel curtains did nothing to dispel the darkness that had settled over my mind. I hadn't slept, not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, inhuman eyes staring back at me, heard the bone-chilling roar that had nearly stopped my heart. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face in a futile attempt to wash away the exhaustion. The mirror reflected a stranger, pale, haunted, with dark circles under wild eyes. I barely recognized myself. It was real, I whispered to my reflection, my voice hoarse. It happened, I'm not crazy. But the words rang hollow, even to my own ears. How could I convince others when I was starting to doubt my own sanity? I returned to the bed, my laptop open to a dozen tabs of Bigfoot research. I had spent the night scouring every site I could find, reading account after account of sightings and encounters. Some were clearly hoaxes, others more believable, but none quite matched the terror of what I had experienced. My phone buzzed, another missed call from my mother. I had been avoiding her, avoiding everyone. How could I explain what had happened? How could anyone who hadn't seen it possibly understand? Against my better judgment, I picked up the phone and dialed her number. Jessica? Oh, thank God. My mother's voice came through thick with worry. We've been so worried. Are you okay? Where are you? I swallowed hard, fighting back tears. I'm okay, Mom. I'm in a motel in Pine Creek. Something happened. In the woods. What happened, sweetie? You're scaring me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Mom, I was attacked by something big, something that shouldn't exist. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When my mother spoke again, her voice was cautious, measured. Jessica, honey, what do you mean? Was it a bear? No, Mom, it was Bigfoot. I know how it sounds, but... Bigfoot? She interrupted, disbelief evident in her tone. Jessica, Are you sure you're feeling all right? Maybe you hit your head or... I'm not crazy, I snapped, immediately regretting my outburst. I'm sorry, You have to believe me, it was real, I saw it, it attacked me. My mother's voice softened, taking on that tone parents use when humoring a child's wild imagination. Okay, sweetie. Why don't you come home? We can talk about this. Get you checked out by a doctor. I ended the call abruptly, unable to bear the pity and disbelief in her voice. Tears streamed down my face as I curled up on the bed, clutching my knees to my chest. Even my own mother thought I was losing my mind. Days blurred together as I remained holed up in the motel room, venturing out only for necessities. I couldn't bear the looks from the townspeople, the whispers that followed me. That's her, they'd say, the crazy Bigfoot girl. My obsession grew. I created timelines of sightings, maps of supposed Bigfoot territories. I reached out to self-proclaimed experts and cryptozoologists. desperate for validation. Some were intrigued by my story, others dismissed it outright. But none could offer the proof I so desperately needed. One particularly sleepless night, I found myself on a video call with Dr. Alan Richter, a zoologist who had spent years studying alleged Bigfoot evidence. "Your account is fascinating, Jessica," he said, his voice tinny through the laptop speakers. "But without physical evidence, it's just another story. Compelling, but unprovable." "But the hair samples," I started. He shook his head. "Inconclusive. They could be from any number of known animals. I'm sorry, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." As the call ended, I felt the last shred of hope slip away. I was alone with my truth, a truth no one else could see or believe. Depression settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stopped answering calls, stopped checking emails. The world outside my motel room ceased to exist. All that remained was the memory of that night, playing on an endless loop in my mind. I could still feel the creature's hot breath on my face, still smell its musky animal odor. The sound of its roar echoed in my ears, drowning out all other thoughts. And those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent, glowing eyes, haunted my every waking moment. One afternoon, a knock at the door startled me from my daze. It was the motel manager, concern etched on his weathered face. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked cautiously. "We haven't seen you in days and, well, people are worried." I stared at him blankly. Worried? About me? Or about the crazy woman in their midst? "I'm fine," I mumbled, moving to close the door. But he held it open, his expression softening. "Look, I don't know what happened to you out there, but whatever it was, staying cooped up in here isn't gonna help. Maybe it's time to think about moving on." Moving on. The words hit me like a physical blow. How could I move on when the truth was still out there, when that creature was still roaming free? I thanked the manager and closed the door, leaning against it as I slid to the floor. He was right in a way. I couldn't stay here forever, couldn't keep chasing a truth no one wanted to believe. But as I looked out the window at the forest looming in the distance, I knew I could never truly leave this behind. The Bigfoot was out there. I had seen it, felt its savage strength. And no matter where I went, no matter how much time passed, I would always be looking over my shoulder, always wondering when it might strike again. As night fell, casting long shadows across the room, I made a decision. I couldn't stay, but I couldn't simply walk away either. Somehow, I had to find a way to live with this knowledge, to carry this burden. I began to pack my meager belongings, my hands shaking slightly. Tomorrow, I would leave Pine Creek. But the memory of what happened here, the truth I now carried, would follow me wherever I went. And somewhere out there, in the dark depths of the forest, I knew the Bigfoot was waiting. Watching. The weeks following my encounter with Bigfoot blurred together in a haze of disbelief and frustration. I watched helplessly as my story faded from the local gossip, becoming nothing more than a punchline, a cautionary tale about the dangers of an overactive imagination. The looks of concern from strangers turned to eye rolls and dismissive chuckles. One afternoon, I overheard two locals chatting at the diner where I'd taken to having my morning coffee. "Remember that Bigfoot girl?" one of them said, snickering. "Haven't seen her around lately. Guess she finally came to her senses." His companion laughed. Probably realized she couldn't milk that story anymore. Bet it was just a bear all along. I gripped my coffee mug tightly, knuckles turning white. If only they knew. If only they could see the scars that still marred my leg. Feel the terror that gripped me every time I heard a twig snap. Despite the ridicule, I couldn't let it go. I continued to scour the forest edges, always careful not to venture too deep, searching for any sign of the creature. But it was as if it had vanished into thin air. No tracks, no tufts of hair, not even a broken branch to suggest its passage. One day, I ran into Sarah Chen, the reporter who had initially dismissed my story. She looked uncomfortable as she approached me. Jessica, she said hesitantly, how are you doing? I forced a smile. Still looking for the truth, Sarah? Still know what I saw? She sighed, her expression a mix of pity and exasperation. Look, I know you believe what you experienced was real, but don't you think it's time to move on? This obsession isn't healthy. Obsession? I repeated, my voice rising. Is that what you call trying to warn people about a very real danger? Sarah held up her hands placatingly. I'm just concerned about you. Maybe talking to someone, a professional, might help you process what happened. I turned away, unable to bear the look in her eyes. Thanks for your concern, I muttered, walking away. As the days turned to weeks and weeks to months, I slowly began to accept that no one would ever truly believe me. The creature had vanished, taking with it any chance I had of proving my story. I tried to move on, to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I got a job at the local library, started talking to my family again. But the memories of that night never faded. They haunted my dreams, turning familiar forests into nightmarish landscapes where glowing eyes watched from every shadow. Even as I went through the motions of daily life, I couldn't shake the habit of constant vigilance. Every time I stepped outside, my eyes would scan the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The sound of rustling leaves would make my heart race, and I'd find myself frozen in place, waiting for the monster to emerge. One evening, as I was locking up the library, I heard a commotion down the street. A group of teenagers were gathered around something, pointing and laughing. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached. What's going on? I asked. One of the kids turned to me, grinning. Check it out. Someone put up these weird Bigfoot warning signs all over town. Isn't it hilarious? My breath caught in my throat as I saw the crudely made sign. It bore a cartoonish image of Bigfoot, with the words, "Danger, Bigfoot Crossing," emblazoned across the top. It's not funny, I said, my voice tight. You shouldn't joke about things you don't understand. The teenagers exchanged glances, then burst into laughter. Oh man, are you that Bigfoot lady? This is priceless. I turned and walked away, their laughter echoing in my ears. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. I was used to this by now, the disbelief, the mockery, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. As I made my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more menacing. I quickened my pace, my hand instinctively going to the pepper spray I now always carried. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I confronted the truth I had been trying to deny. The Bigfoot was still out there. It hadn't vanished. It had simply retreated, biding its time. And I was the only one who knew the full extent of the danger. The realization was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because I knew the creature could strike again at any time. Comforting because it validated my experience, reaffirmed that I wasn't crazy. As the years passed, I learned to live with this knowledge. I built a life for myself, made new friends, even started dating again. But I never fully relaxed, never let my guard down completely. I became known in cryptozoology circles. My story circulated on forums and in books about Bigfoot encounters. Some believed me, many didn't. But I no longer cared about convincing others. I knew the truth, and that had to be enough. Still, there were moments when the memory would hit me with full force. A documentary about unexplained phenomena would send me spiraling back to that night. A camping trip with friends would leave me sleepless. Every sound outside the tent a potential threat. Today, as I stand at the edge of town looking out at the vast expanse of forest, I'm struck by a profound sense of unease. The trees sway gently in the breeze, peaceful and inviting. But I know better. I know what lurks in those shadowy depths. A jogger passes by, nodding a greeting. Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it? He says cheerfully. I force a smile. Just be careful out there, I reply. You never know what you might encounter. He gives me an odd look before continuing on his way. I watch him disappear down the trail, fighting the urge to call him back, to warn him of the danger he's running towards. But I know it would be useless. No one believes in monsters until they see them with their own eyes. And by then it's often too late. As I turn to head back into town, I cast one last glance at the forest. Somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows, I know the Bigfoot is waiting, watching, perhaps even now seeking its next victim. And I am left with the haunting knowledge that I alone understand the true nature of the beast that lurks in the wilderness. A silent, deadly presence, forever etched in my memory, forever changing the way I see the world around me. The Bigfoot may have vanished from sight, but it will never truly be gone, not for me.